grandmama from? I said, no, don't tell me. Mississippi. He said, well, how do you know that? I said, because you're in Detroit. You're in Chicago. That's why, because they're from Mississippi, Alabama, or Arkansas. If you went to California, doesn't mean none of these from Louisiana, Oklahoma, or Texas. I said, you one generation removed from the outhouse and the pump.
That's right.
One generation removed.
That's right.
But what did that generation do? It was a generation where you could get $5 a day job in a factory. It was a generation where your children might not have to go to schools that were separate and unequal. In many instances, they end up going to separate schools.
Right.
In many instances, when they got to Chicago or they arrived in Detroit, they end up going to separate schools. But it was different. It was a new land. If they went to Harlem on the East Coast, it was a new land. Okay, so when you talk about this reason to leave, when people make a decision to do that, it's not an easy task to decide that I'm going to leave behind family, the life that I know, to move to a new place. But fortunately, the railroads exist. And these trains could whisk you away. You could ride in a colored car back there. You have these throngs of people who are leaving the South to work in coal mines or to work in a mill or to work on the line of this new plant. Those African Americans left places like Mississippi and went to Chicago. And think about what life was like for them. They go to Chicago and they stop at the train station and arrive. Cars in the street, mixed with buildings are tall. It's cold as can be. Right?
Right.
Hopefully Aunt Fanny had been there before you do, so she knew the way around. Or Uncle Bob had gone there. But if you were new, you didn't know how to react to the city. I mean, you're fresh from Mississippi. You want to sit on the front porch and drink tea, but it's cold. It's not hot, right?
Right.
So what happens is, for these African Americans who decide to make this movement to the north, again, if you were from the middle, these southern states of Mississippi, Arkansas, you make your way north to Chicago, to Detroit, Indiana. If you were on the East Coast, if you were from North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, you went Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, New York. And what happens is, within these communities, these urban blacks who have been living there now meet with these rural blacks. And something unique and interesting happens. Because while there was the Booker T who was saying industry, skill, weight, there were others like DuBois who was saying you need to know the classics and music and understand black strivings. You need to be engaged in art. And interestingly enough, I always think that for me, again here I go editorializing, when you read Du Bois' last interview before he died, he was interviewed and he was living in Ghana at the time, and you all know that he passed on the day of the March on Washington. So when he was interviewed, and you can go online and see this, it's actually, the Atlantic Monthly has a digital online archive of their old articles. It's pretty neat. I mean, it goes far back there, the Atlantic Monthly. And you can just type in whoever. You can do, slave narratives or anything, and it'll pull up the relevant articles that it has on it. And so one of these is an interview with W.E.B. Du Bois, and he talks about, and so the interviewer asked him, well, were you and Booker T really at odds like that? He said, no. He said, I think it was probably more about our followers than it was about us. And so he talks about how, when very early on, that he went to a meeting with Booker T. And he and Booker T were going to see none other than the great industrial magnate, Andrew Carnegie. And he was saying that as he was walking with Booker T asked him if he had read Andrew Carnegie's book, and Du Bois said, "No, I have not." And Booker T smiled and said, "You should read it. He likes to know that people have read it." And then he says, "You stay down here and I'm gonna go up there to the meeting." What's interesting about that is Du Bois says, "I don't know if he left me on the bottom floor because he didn't trust me to play the game with Mr. Carnegie." You know, sort of that thing you talked about earlier. Is he just flattering Mr. Carnegie, telling him that we'll do this to get the money that he needs to do what he needs to do?
Right.
Or what is his motive? It's a very interesting piece to add to a lesson. But you have this. You have these northern blacks and these southern blacks who are mixed. And in many ways, there's a beautiful and delicate balance of tension that happens. Because you see, the first thing is some of the southern blacks, they want to come to Detroit and they want to hang the clothes out on the front porch. Right? Or they want to throw the chicken bowls into the front yard. You can't do that. You did it down in the country. So organizations pop up, like the Urban League, or the Negro or Colored Improvement Association, to help people navigate urban life, to help them learn the skills that they need to learn to survive in that urban world. What's also very interesting is that when that happens, the explosion of art and culture tends to emerge. I don't understand how one could teach a lesson about the Great Migration without beginning to talk about what's coming to the North. Things like the buzzer pop, the jitterbug. I mean, these dances are emerging because of the music that these Southern blacks are bringing up. They're stopping off in places like St. Louis and Memphis, and this hot hub of culture is happening. They're bringing jazz that's mixed, and these new dances, and this different way of dressing. You know, if I go back to this picture, one of the things that I think Lawrence does, he makes this very colorful picture. But they don't want to wear the gray suits and the brown ties when they arrive in Chicago or in Detroit. Why not? Anybody tell me why they want to dress like everybody else? Why on earth would you walk down the street of Chicago and you see someone who hasn't been here from Arkansas or Mississippi too long, and they on a bright red shirt and a pair of checkered pants and some yellow suspenders? Why would they do that? How many of you all to identify themselves? That's the reason. How many of you all have uniforms at your school? Yep, you have uniforms. What happens when the kids are allowed to wear their own clothes? Huh? What happens? They make a statement, right? They're like, "Whoo, I got him cast off the shackles of conformity," right? And I can do my own thing. That's what the North was for these folks. No longer holding my head down. No longer walking as a white person, moving to the other side of the road. I don't have to do that here. These are things that when you teach these lessons, because it's a uniquely American story. It really, really is. Because when we talk about the Great Migration, we don't also talk about how the trouble emerged in the North. Because the same blacks who are moving north for a better life are finding that the same whites are moving north as well for a better life as well. It's a uniquely American story. I mean, who doesn't want a better job? Who doesn't want to be free and express their individualism? That is so much a part of this migration story. What's also very interesting about this migration story is that we hear so much about Harlem. And Harlem, indeed, was a great Mecca. It was a great Mecca where they had the Renaissance and writers. But there was a Harlem, in a sense, in many places. A Harlem in St. Louis, a Harlem in Chicago. And what was happening is that so much was opening up to these African Americans. You know, you have these normal schools like Fisk and Tubal, all these colleges that had, so they were trained as teachers. They could go to the nursing pool. Detroit was one of the few cities that I would love that Detroit has always got volunteered. Now that might not sound interesting to you, but when you break down that Detroit also at one time was a major school system in the United States where they had the most PhDs in the classroom.